Pokémon is a series that really needs no introduction. It's the highest grossing media franchise of all time, and by like a pretty solid margin. You know Pokémon, your parents know Pokémon, depending on your age, your grandparents probably know Pokémon, or Pokéman as my grandma called it. And a huge part of why the franchise is so big comes down to two major factors. The games, obviously, and the anime. With Red and Blue and the anime both being released in the US in the same month, September of 1998. An absolutely genius marketing move that gained hype and continued to build upon it. And while real gamers like me have seen every episode of the original Pokémon anime run, there's one episode that has always stuck out as fairly infamous. One of the few episodes of Pokémon that's been completely banned from ever being shown again. But for all the love and admiration that the early years of Pokémon still receives, I mean, Ash Ketchum leaving as the main protagonist was like front page news, there's one huge black spot on Pokémon's legacy. Aside from Dexit, something I really didn't have much of a problem with actually. Pokémon power creep is a whole different thing. No, this is an incident so insane and well known that even The Simpsons have referenced it. An incident that led to over 600 children being hospitalized. Today we're going to go through the history of the infamous Porygon episode, the episode that almost destroyed Pokémon. As a quick note going into this episode, while I may show portions of the episode, I'm obviously not going to be showing the strobe effect that we're going to be mainly talking about in any meaningful capacity. I will show it significantly slowed down, so no need to worry about any seizures or anything. At that point, it'll just be two separate colored screens. The year is 1997. While the anime has not yet debuted in the US, it's been running in Japan for the better part of a year. While the anime was far from the cultural juggernaut that it would become, it was still pretty huge. By December of 1997, when the episode we're talking about would air, the anime was definitely picking up steam. We were actually up to the 38th episode of the anime, an episode featuring Porygon. So, in this episode, Team Rocket has stolen a Porygon and are using this Porygon to go inside a computer to steal other Pokemon directly out of the box system that we see used in the game. Honestly, that might be the best idea that Team Rocket has ever had in the entire series run. Like, it's simple, it's clean, and it's seemingly hard to track. That is, until Ash and his friends are sent into cyberspace with the help of a different Porygon, because that's apparently something they can just do. And while confronting Team Rocket, Pikachu uses Thunderbolt. This leads to a huge explosion of colors. And this explosion of colors, or more specifically 2 colors, is the crux of what we're talking about today. You see, it wasn't actually Porygon who caused the seizure-inducing sequence within the anime. It was Pikachu. But like obviously, if you're banking on Pikachu becoming the series mascot, you wouldn't want something like several hundred seizures to be tied to your mascot. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, the original scene is airing. Around this time, several hundred children who were watching all began to exhibit some different symptoms. Some kids were nauseous, experienced blurred vision, felt dizzy, or straight up passed out. Those were the luckier of the kids who showed symptoms, because others had seizures or experienced total temporary blindness. While this is where most people think that this is where it ends, it's actually not. Because while the episode itself only ever aired once, the segment in question was re-aired on the news. And believe it or not, replaying a specific segment of a TV series that seemed to cause seizures and adverse reaction in hundreds of children caused more seizures and adverse reactions in children. This is like if the news got a hold of the videotape from The Ring and then just played it while talking over it and dooming whoever watched. It's an absolutely insane thing to do, and that actually happened. All in all, north of 650 kids were put into ambulances. While the majority of kids would recover during the ambulance trip to the hospital, there were still more than 150 who were fully admitted. The numbers on just how many were affected both briefly and more seriously vary pretty wildly depending on what source you're looking at, though we do know that at least 2 children were hospitalized for more than 2 weeks. This incident would become known as the Pokémon shock. Let's talk about the strobing sequence itself. The sequence itself features a combination of 2 separate animation techniques that come together in a bit of an unholy union. The first animation technique is something called Paka. This technique was used relatively frequently and mainly just consisted of changing back and forth pretty quickly between 2 different colors. In this case, going back and forth between a red and a blue. This was designed to help build tension around specific scenes, and all things considered, it's a much cheaper and easier way to animate explosions and the like. The second animation technique is simply called flash. It's much more self-explanatory, basically just a bright beam of light. While either of these on their own could probably cause at least some of the symptoms we've been talking about, both of them together sort of amplified everything a step further than it otherwise would have been. In essence, while the bright lights from the flash technique may have caused a reaction in a few select people, the addition of the Paka style of coloring made it much more likely to cause a reaction. Before we get into some more technical stuff with the scene in question, a really quick explanation of some of the terms I'll be using, or specifically one term that I'll be talking about and feel it would be a good idea to break down. That would be the term hertz. Most people have heard and understand what this term means, but I think going a bit deeper can help understand what exactly is happening. At its base, hertz is a measurement of frequency of cycles per second. When you hear of a computer monitor being 144 hertz, it means that the monitor itself is refreshing its image on screen 144 times per second. Simple enough. From here, we can move on to the flicker frame threshold. This is basically a fancy way of saying how many hertz the human eye needs to see to comprehend and see fluid or steady movement. There are upper thresholds of frames per second or FPS that the human eye can see, but that's kind of up to debate as to where that actually is. Most movies are shot and aired at 24 frames per second, 24 hertz. But changing the amount of frames can allow images to seem more fluid or more lifelike, or allow the opposite to happen, to make animation or other media have a different feel or achieve a different effect. And quickly, let's define what exactly a seizure is. It's abnormal, excessive, or synchronous discharges of neurons in the brain. Think of it as a circuit board. Some wires or neurons can discharge an excessive amount of electricity constantly, causing a seizure. Or one wire or neuron can discharge to a second, then to a third, and so on and so forth, but eventually these feed back to the first neuron, creating a circle of electrical discharges. This can happen in a very small part of the brain, meaning the individual is usually awake and alert, and this can cause things like one-arm jerking, called focal seizures, previously termed partial seizures. Or it can involve larger parts of both sides of the brain, which usually means the individual loses consciousness, and can involve shaking of the whole body. Generalized seizures, or previously termed tonic-clonic or grand mal seizures. Either way, a vast majority of seizures only last seconds to a few minutes and stop on their own. It's very rare that they last longer, and if they last longer than 5 minutes, they're classified as this and is a medical emergency. So in actuality, there were 2 scenes within the episode that are seemingly at fault. The first contains only the Paka animation technique. A flicker series ranging from 0.5 to 4 seconds with alternating red, white, blue light, and red-blue light creating mostly a 12 Hz display. This scene, despite being a very brief few seconds, mainly just caused some discomfort amongst viewers. And then there's the main scene in question, where, once again over a 4-second period, the red and blue coloring alternated at 12 Hz. A rate of 12 Hz for the alternating colors is the important part here. For many people who have photosensitive epilepsy, flashing lights and colors between 3 and 30 Hz can cause seizures, though of course that varies from person to person. Some people are sensitive up to 60 Hz, but that and sensitivity to anything below 3 Hz are uncommon. Photosensitive epilepsy itself is actually pretty rare as well, affecting only about 1 in 4,000 people. But the thing is, it's much more common in children. affecting upwards of 1 in 20. That number decreases as they age, and according to a doctor friend of mine, yeah, I reached out to a man who spent years in medical school and works professionally as a doctor to ask him my dumb questions about Pokemon. Seizures in children are actually fairly common as well. In fact, for children, it's not actually considered a serious condition until multiple seizures have occurred. Because children's brains are still growing and developing, seizure activity changes as the brain itself changes and develops. In fact, according to my doctor friend, who I'll be referring to as Dr. Friend going forward, an estimated 0.5 to 1% of children will experience at least one afebrile, not related to a fever, seizure by adolescence. Alternatively, 3 to 5% of children will experience at least one febrile, related to fever, seizure in the first 5 years of life. Febrile seizures are more common because fevers are known to lower the seizure threshold or make it easier for the brain to short circuit, which again is essentially what a seizure is. Dr. Friend says photosensitive seizures are different as they would be classified as a provoked seizure. Hence, prevalence is harder to gauge. They would typically not treat these since seizure recurrence is rare outside of the inciting incident. Like any epilepsy syndrome, low sleep can increase risk of seizure, as can being closer to the screen or seeing the effect in a dark room. You can take medication for this or avoid triggers, and if a trigger does arise, covering one eye can greatly reduce the risk of having a seizure. Interestingly, closing both eyes or turning both eyes away does not reduce the risk. Thankfully, despite the show's original airing and the accidental re-airing on the news, there were seemingly no long-term side effects. As stated earlier, there were 2 individuals who spent upwards of a few weeks hospitalized, but as just said, seizures aren't the most uncommon thing to happen to children. Strangely, this wasn't the first time we've seen Paka Paka used in anime, and if we do a bit of digging, it's also not the first time that it's caused seizures. Earlier that same year, 1997, an episode of Yat Untroubled Space Tours resulted in 4 children being hospitalized. The difference in numbers probably just resulted from Pokemon being much more popular and watched by way more people. It's estimated that the show had 16.5% of the audience in that time slot, meaning nearly 4.15 million families across Japan watched that episode of Pokemon. So it certainly seems like previous episodes could have had similar consequences if as many people had watched it. The fallout of the Porygon episode was astronomical. This got coverage here in America, which sounds like a no-brainer, until you remember that this was 1997. Pokemon wasn't a thing here yet. If you look up CNN articles talking about the seizures, they're constantly referring to it as pocket monsters, which even my mom doesn't do anymore. The Pokemon anime ended up going off the air for 4 months, something that's basically unheard of for a weekly airing anime like Pokemon. While today we see more seasonal releases, we still have relics like One Piece, which have been running for well over 1,000 episodes. Which is too many to be honest, and I love One Piece. Regardless, Pokemon went off the air for 4 months. For a lot of shows, this absolutely could have, and maybe should have, been a death sentence. A weekly show all of a sudden disappearing after a huge blunder feels like putting it lightly, but blunder would destroy a lesser IP. When the show returned in April of 1998, they actually changed their time slot from Thursdays to Tuesdays, and began the whole thing with a special Problem Inspection Report on the Pocket Monsters anime. This basically went over what happened, why, and showed some art and letters from fans who were concerned that this would lead to the show being cancelled, which really wouldn't be too surprising considering the circumstances. But there were some edits that we saw when looking at the show going forward in even some past episodes. They really toned down a lot of the flashing lights and colors. There are actually some pretty good compilations on YouTube that show some of the differences. Again, be careful here if you plan on going and trying to watch some of them if you're photosensitive at all. I'd hate for anything to happen to anyone. This episode also led to a lot of different international agencies coming together to find some ways to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. In Japan specifically, they limited the amount of times that colors can flash per second to a maximum of 5 times per second, 3 times per second if the sequence includes the color red, as well as limiting the length of flashing segments to a duration of less than 2 seconds. This kind of culminates in the Harding test, a way to look at videos and media to test if something is safe or not. Today, there's a whole website that you can go check any media of your own. Nintendo itself also faced a pretty huge backlash because of the whole thing. Their stocks plummeted 3.2%. Pokemon games in Japan were pulled from shelves out of fear. Nintendo's then president sort of distanced the company from the anime, at least for the time being, basically saying that they only made the games and, believe it or not, the games were only in black and white, which is a pretty fair way of putting it, honestly. The biggest fallout from the whole thing is the fact that Porygon has basically been banned from ever appearing in the anime in any meaningful fashion. In not just Porygon, but its whole evolution line, which is incredibly unfair. At this point, even Pokemon itself has admitted that Porygon wasn't to blame for anything, tweeting out in 2020 Porygon did nothing wrong, which is pretty based and also correct. It wasn't Porygon, it was Pikachu. But this poor Pokemon got used as a scapegoat to keep the franchise's mascot safe, which at the end of the day created one of, if not the, most recognizable brand mascots in world history. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.